Alrighty, here is the first of several lessons on global climate change. First, we're going to talk about the greenhouse effect. So, before we can talk about the greenhouse effect itself, let's talk about energy coming into the Earth's atmosphere from the sun. So, incoming solar radiation consists of um, light waves, light rays, but there are different types of them. These are all found in the electromagnetic spectrum, and we call them electromagnetic radiation. There's shortwave radiation. This is higher energy stuff. This includes visible light, which allows us to see, as well as UV radiation, which we talked about when we talked about ozone depletion. There's also long wave radiation. This is lower energy and it's mostly infrared light. Now, infrared is usually going to be carrying heat energy. And that's a very important distinction to make because that heat energy can then be trapped in the atmosphere, which is what's going to cause the greenhouse effect. Now, some of the incoming high energy radiation is actually reflected back into space, which is what you're seeing here. So this is all incoming solar radiation. Here is some reflected by clouds. Here is some reflected by the surface. But then a lot of it ends up being absorbed either by the atmosphere or by the surface. And then it's re-radiated as infrared or long wave energy. So see, that's being radiated back from the Earth's surface. That's being emitted by clouds, that's being released by the atmosphere. And it's this infrared radiation, this heat energy, that's going to be absorbed by greenhouse gases. So that's kind of what's important to think about. The Earth has all sorts of solar radiation coming in. Whatever is absorbed ends up being radiated or released out back as heat energy. And that heat energy or infrared radiation can be trapped by greenhouse gases. Now, if a physics teacher or a very dedicated physics student is watching this, they will point out some of the errors in what I've said. It's not exactly 100% accurate according to physics, but this is enough of an understanding for our AP Environmental Science test. So, what is the greenhouse effect? What ends up happening is when solar radiation hits the Earth's surface, whatever is kind of absorbed and then radiated out as infrared radiation and heat is going to go up into the atmosphere, where greenhouse gases will absorb it, and they can kind of reflect it back towards the Earth's surface where it goes back up into the atmosphere where it can be absorbed by more greenhouse gases, and that can just keep happening so that a lot of that heat is not lost into space. And while a lot of people think that the greenhouse effect is harmful because it's associated with climate change, it's actually necessary for life on Earth. Without the greenhouse effect, our average temperature on the planet would be about negative 18 degrees Celsius, well below the freezing point for water, compared to what the 20th century average was of 14 degrees Celsius. So it's quite a dramatic difference. And the greenhouse effect is necessary for life as we know it. Without it, Earth would be too cold to support life. So we've mentioned greenhouse gases a couple of times. Let's talk about them. Greenhouse gases, like I said, absorb heat energy. And to measure how much heat energy they absorb, we have a measurement called global warming potential, or GWP. I'll tend to probably call it warming potential or GWP if I remember to. So, this is a measure of how much energy 1 ton of gas can absorb over the course of 100 years relative to the emissions of 1 ton of CO2 over the course of 100 years. We count CO2 as our kind of baseline gas because it's a very common one, and it's one of the ones that we've been increasing the amounts of quite a bit through human activity. This allows us to compare the global warming impact of different gases, even though different amounts of them are released, and they have different impacts on energy absorption in the atmosphere. If a gas has a larger global warming potential, that means it warms the Earth more compared to CO2. So let's look at the principal greenhouse gases. CO2 is probably the most well known, but there is also methane or CH4. We talked about this with landfills that it also has an impact on climate change. It absorbs energy. Water vapor is also a principal greenhouse gas, but we're going to talk about that. There's a kind of an asterisk here that we'll talk about in a little bit. Nitrous oxide or N2O and chlorofluorocarbons or CFCs. A note, this was also seen in ozone depletion. This is an ozone depleting chemical. And there are some replacements for CFCs that are not ozone depleting and do some of the same jobs, but they're also greenhouse gases. Those are the only links that we're going to have on the test between ozone depletion and climate change. Ozone depletion can be caused by some of the chemicals that are also contributing to climate change, but never say ozone depletion causes climate change or the opposite. Climate change does not cause ozone depletion. Never ever say that on the test. It will not earn you points. So now let's talk about where these greenhouse gases come from and their potency. Remember, potency is the strength, which is pretty much what's the global warming potential? How powerful is it, a greenhouse gas is it compared to CO2? So first, let's start with CO2. CO2 is our baseline for comparison, so we have set the global warming potential of that to 1. CO2 can remain in the atmosphere for thousands of years. So, in 1,000 years, some of the CO2 that's being emitted right now may still be in the atmosphere. Where does that CO2 come from? Well, the biggest chunk by far is combustion of fossil fuels or waste. Sorry, forgot a comma there. And so this is this part of the pie chart and this part of the pie chart. Um, Possibly, no, that's most of it. So about, looks like 65% of the CO2 emissions are coming from fossil fuel combustion. Concrete production actually does produce a very large amount of fossil fuels. That 19% of CO2 emissions is a lot of it's probably coming from concrete production. So that's why people are trying to find alternate means of producing concrete to try and reduce the global impact of concrete production. Then there are various other smaller sources. So if we wanted to make a dramatic increase in the amount of CO2 being released, we would have to try to figure out an alternative for concrete production as well as fossil fuel combustion. Now, methane, it has a global warming potential between 27 and 30. This means it is almost 30 times stronger a greenhouse gas than CO2. So if I released a ton of methane into the atmosphere, not a ton like, oh, a lot, but like a measurement, a ton of methane into the atmosphere, that would be the same as releasing like 30 tons of CO2 into the atmosphere. So it has a much bigger impact. It lasts in the atmosphere about 10 years, so a less of a lifespan than carbon dioxide, but in that time it can still have a large impact. Some of the anthropogenic sources. Landfills, so that's municipal solid waste, produce a lot of methane. Some agricultural activity, especially dealing with manure. Coal mining can produce methane. Oil and natural gas systems, then combustion, there's also wastewater treatment. There are some industrial processes. Biomass can produce some. There's other agricultural sources. Rice cultivation actually produces a lot of methane. That is something I've seen show up on the AP test before. So if you're asked about sources of methane, you could say things like landfills and municipal solid waste. You could say manure management, and you can also say rice cultivation. Enteric fermentation, that I believe is basically uh it's it's basically cow farts. It's farting. So as organisms, animals, mammals particularly, um, digest food in their intestines. We have symbiotic bacteria living with us, and these bacteria will break down some of our food and produce methane. And methane can be produced either by farting or by burping. And you may think, oh, does that mean humans aren't allowed to fart anymore? No, it's when we raise large amounts of livestock. They tend to be fed things that are not what they're naturally have evolved to eat, and that causes them to release lots of methane, especially when we have like hundreds of millions of cattle that we're raising. Right. Water vapor. Notice water vapor is one of the greenhouse gases up here that has the tiniest global warming potential. It's so tiny, it's negative sometimes. And that is because it stays in the atmosphere for an extremely short period of time. It is responsible for about half of the natural greenhouse effect. So it is responsible for warming the planet to make life on Earth sustainable, but we don't consider it contributing significantly to climate change because it's in the atmosphere for such a short period of time. However, there are some other things to think about. As global air temperature increases, hotter air can hold more water vapor. Also, it increases evaporation rates. And that would mean that water vapor would have a larger impact on the temperature of the Earth, which would increase global air temperature, which would increase water vapor in the atmosphere. So, this would be an example of a positive feedback loop, which is there is some change in the system, and reactions to that change are going to increase the strength of the change. Nitrous oxide has a global warming potential of 273. That means for every ton of nitrous oxide released into the air has the same impact as close to 300 tons of carbon dioxide. That's quite a large amount. It remains in the atmosphere for less time than CO2, less than 100 years, but for longer than methane. Some of the sources that humans release are agriculture, industrial activities, combustion of both solid fuels, and combustion of waste, as well as wastewater treatment. So here are various sources here. Notice most of it comes from our agricultural soil management and chlorofluorocarbons. Notice I don't have a pie chart because honestly, all chlorofluorocarbons are anthropogenic. A lot of these chlorinated hydrocarbons, CFCs, HFCs, HCFCs, which are hydrochlorofluorocarbons, and perfluorocarbons, PFCs, all of those are greenhouse gases. Their global warming potential can be anywhere up to the high 1000s. What that means is if you release 1 ton of CFCs into the atmosphere, that has the same impact as releasing 1,000 tons of CO2 into the atmosphere. So these are very potent, very powerful greenhouse gases. They can remain in the atmosphere for a very long time, from anywhere from 50 to 1,000 years, which is also going to contribute to their potency because once they're up there absorbing heat for a very long time. All of them are man made chemicals, so any source of them is anthropogenic. All right, that is the end of this current lesson on greenhouse gases. On climate change, we've got a couple more coming up.